In 2003, high school sweethearts Sarah Rodriguez and Matt Corbett were 21 and 20 years old and had their whole lives ahead of them. They were planning for the future and building a life together. But Sarah's past was holding her back. Her ex-boyfriend Richard had been stalking her for months, unable to accept that she didn't want to be with him anymore. The restraining order she had against him wasn't enough. One day in April, Richard followed Sarah and Matt as they were on their way to Bible study in Sarah's car and shot them both in the head. Sarah was killed instantly, but Matt miraculously survived. That was the start of an investigation that would uncover secrets that not even Sarah's family knew about the difficult relationship she and her ex-boyfriend had. Today on the back of the archive, we're taking a look at the case of Sarah Rodriguez, a sad story of how sometimes, even when you ask for help, the stalker can still find a way to hurt you anyway. Sarah Rodriguez was born in 1982 and lived in Placentia, California. Like its name indicates, Placentia was a pleasant and safe place to live. Its neighborhoods were very family-friendly, and the crime rate was especially low compared to other areas in the county. There, Sarah grew up surrounded by her family, who remember her as a very approachable and funny person with a great heart. Helping others was in her nature, so when she graduated high school, nobody was surprised when she pursued a career in child development. She was attending college and working as a preschool teacher on the side. Sarah came from a religious family, and her faith was a big part of her daily life. Whoever spent time with her had to understand how important this aspect of her life was, and her boyfriend, Matt Corbett, understood and shared this devotion with her. Matt was only a few months younger than Sarah, and since high school, the two had been dating. Despite taking a break for a few months in 2002, they were back together in 2003 and stronger than ever. Matt and Sarah understood and respected each other, and Sarah's family were convinced that the two were heading towards a beautiful life together. Sadly, their time together would reach an abrupt ending in April of 2003, when tragedy struck Sarah and Matt. Like we mentioned earlier, Sarah was very devoted to her faith, and she and Matt usually attended Bible study together. On April 16th of 2003, Sarah picked Matt up in her car. That evening they had Bible study, but before heading over there, they decided to pick up some takeout from a local restaurant and have it at home. On their way back from the restaurant, at around 5 p.m., a black Nissan cut them off on the road. Someone exited the car and went straight for the driver's side where Sarah was sitting. They pulled out a gun and shot her straight in the head. Immediately, and before Matt could get out of the car, the killer ran to the passenger side and shot Matt multiple times, both on his body and his head. Then, the mysterious gunman drove away. It was the middle of the afternoon in April, and of course many neighbors heard the commotion and the shots. When looking out the window, they saw Sarah's car and two people sitting motionless inside. They immediately called 911, and emergency services made their way to Hill Street, which was now pronounced a crime scene. Although emergency services arrived very quickly after the neighbors called them, Sarah was already dead. She'd sustained one single shot to the head, but that had been enough to take her life. Matt, on the other hand, was still alive. Despite having received several shots, he was still breathing and was rushed to the hospital. He was in critical condition, and odds weren't playing in his favor, but he was still alive. The crime scene delivered little to no clues about what happened. There were no fingerprints recovered from the car, suggesting whoever shot the couple either wore gloves or barely touched the doors or the inside. No bullet casings were found either. Since the gunman had escaped so quickly, it was unlikely that he'd stopped to pick them up, so investigators thought the murder weapon could have been a revolver and left no casings behind. Neighbors were interviewed and confirmed that the car that cut Sarah and Matt off was a black Nissan. They weren't able to identify the killer, other than the fact that it was a man, but nobody recognized or was able to give a description. The more they looked into what little evidence they had, the more investigators believed this was a crime of passion. It was the middle of the day, on a quiet suburban street. Nothing was stolen, and the car had deliberately cut them off to shoot them. Everything pointed at a targeted attack against Sarah and Matt. But who wanted to harm them? To find out more, police began questioning the couple's circle, starting with one of Sarah's friends who was actually at the crime scene. When police taped off the crime scene, a young man seemed to be trying to get a closer look. It turns out it was a friend of Sarah's who was in the neighborhood and recognized her car. Police asked him questions right there on the spot, and after a few conversations, he mentioned a young man Sarah had been having trouble with, an ex-boyfriend who'd been bothering her for months. Sarah's family confirmed this information and also mentioned an ex-boyfriend of Sarah's. His name was Richard Namey. 26-year-old Richard Namey was also a local to Placentia. It's not clear how they met, but it's suspected it was mutual friends who introduced them. Sarah and Richard didn't date for long, just around 8 months, but when she ended things with him, he didn't take it well. He became violent towards her, threatened her, and even physically assaulted her. Things only got worse when he found out that Sarah and Matt were back together. Richard would follow Sarah when she was going to class or coming home from work. He would say things to her from his car, and he constantly told her she was making a mistake. Sarah kept a personal journal which investigators were able to access. In this journal, she talked about Richard and all the terrible things that happened during their relationship. He threw things at her, threatened her if she pressed charges, and he told her she'd better not get a restraining order since he was in probation and could be sent back to jail. If that happened, he'd sworn to kill her. Sarah detailed all of these accounts in her personal journal, but she never shared them with her family. As with many other cases of domestic violence, the victim often hides behind a feeling of shame and fear. All she wished for was for him to leave her alone and let her live her life in peace. Despite Richard's threats, investigators found that on April 1st, just 2 weeks before she was shot to death, Sarah had filed a restraining order to keep Richard away from her. She'd done exactly what he told her not to do, and considering the outcome, it started to look like Richard had gone through with his threats. As soon as investigators learned this information, they tried to contact him, but he was nowhere to be found. Nobody was answering the door at his apartment, and police began looking for him at the places he was usually found. He was definitely a person of interest. However, there was still a big problem. There was no way of connecting him to the crime scene, since the car registered in his name at the DMV was a blue Chevrolet El Camino, and not a black Nissan like the one at the crime scene. While investigators try and locate Richard to question him, Matt Corbett regained consciousness at the hospital. The shots he received had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and he'd lost sight out of one of his eyes. At this point, he still didn't know his girlfriend had passed, and wouldn't find out for a few weeks, so as not to affect his recovery. Regardless, he was miraculously alive, and after an extensive surgery and many critical hours, he was awake and eager to speak about what happened. Police already saw Richard Namey as a person of interest, but once they were able to speak to the victim, he confirmed what they suspected. Matt identified Richard as the man who'd tried to kill him. Sarah's restraining order against Richard Namey wasn't his first one. Another ex-girlfriend was also threatened to death by Richard, who pointed a gun at her after finding out she'd filed a restraining order against him. Although he didn't kill her, she got so scared away after that incident that she moved as far away as she could to escape Richard's wrath. The more investigators dug into Richard's past, the more they began to know him. As well as a history of violence towards partners, Richard was also very problematic in his family. He was a drug user, he stole frequently, he had violent behavior, he had a child he wasn't involved with. Speaking to his family only confirmed suspicions that Richard was possibly behind the homicide. And then, Richard's sister gave investigators the piece of evidence they needed to put him at the scene. Richard drove a blue Chevrolet, but on the day of the murder, he told his sister his car wasn't working and he needed to borrow hers. The car in question was a black Nissan, and it matched the description given by the witnesses at the scene. Police officially named Richard a suspect and released a warrant for his arrest, as well as getting a warrant to search his apartment. Inside, there was no Richard, but there were 3 notes addressing his family. Notes in which he apologized for what was going to happen to him and how the world would be a better place without him. It seemed that Richard Namey was going to take his own life. Police established surveillance around the county, trying to find him before he took his life or fled the state. But the search was unsuccessful, and investigators grew more and more anxious. They were very close to solving the case, but they seemed to be very far away from finding their suspect. While police were looking everywhere for Richard, a few miles away, in Santa Ana, officers were being called to a car hijacking in which the suspect was armed. The car owner hadn't been harmed, but the suspect had sped off with their car and police began chasing him. The intense chase continued for several minutes until the suspect got out of the car and ran into a tunnel underneath a local school. It was dark and officers knew he was armed, but luckily they were able to apprehend him and take him into custody. When he was arrested, he told officers, "I'm going away for life, you don't understand." Police didn't understand why he thought stealing a car would send him away for life, until they asked for his ID. His name was Richard Namey, and immediately officers recognized him as the murder suspect their neighbors in the Placentia Police Department were looking for. Richard Namey was taken into custody and immediately confessed to shooting the gun that killed Sarah and injured Matt. The notes left saying goodbye to his family had only been a distraction to try and get away from the area before he was found. None of it was true. However, as soon as he confessed, he began blaming everything on Sarah. Painting himself as the victim, he told investigators it was her fault for treating him badly and breaking up their relationship. Even though they weren't together, he considered she was cheating on him for getting back with Matt, and he had to do something about it. The detectives who questioned Richard remember his lack of accountability for anything he'd done. He teared up talking about how much he'd gone through and how horrible Sarah had been to him, but he showed no remorse for shooting the couple. Sarah was the one who made him do what he did, and it was her fault that Matt would now be in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. A year later, in 2004, Richard Namey's trial began, in which he was charged with the murder of Sarah Rodriguez and the attempted murder of Matt Corbett. Those who attended the trial said it was an incredibly emotional moment. Many of Sarah's family members and friends wore t-shirts with the couple's picture on them. And when Matt testified, the silence in the courtroom was heartbreaking. "I lost the only girl I could ever really talk to," he said in a cracked voice. "I just miss Sarah. I'd give anything to have her here." Sarah's mother also testified, and even addressed Richard, calling him an evil coward. Richard Namey's trial lasted 1 week, and the jury found him guilty in both charges. His total sentence was 101 years to life behind bars, a sentence he's still serving today and will probably continue to do so for the rest of his days. But Sarah's family will never get their loved one back, and Matt will be faced with the scars of that terrible day for the rest of his life. Sarah and Matt are victims of a system that not only cannot help those who are too scared to ask for help, but also sometimes struggles to protect those who take a step and speak up. If you or anyone you know are at risk of suffering domestic violence, please speak up and seek help with loved ones and local hotlines and authorities. Take care and stay safe.